another global institution, if anyone wants to hazard a guess. The three of them together are sometimes called the unholy trinity, which is a little bit biased, if you ask me, but
the UN?
Well, yes, so we are talking definitely around that era, but what became the World Trade Organization. So this sense of kind of regulation of the global economy, they're going to play a big role in it. But the context of all of this is happening for us is about trying to challenge a very dominant idea in how we think about global poverty. So we look at the world, if you're paying any attention, it's very obvious that it's extraordinarily unequal, the world we live in. And the lens and the response that we tend to get to that is charity. So the world is very unfair, and what can I, as a good citizen, try to do about that? As somebody who's empathetic, as somebody who cares. But very often charity is the lens I'm given from a very young age, the one I get to keep for most of my life probably, is this lens of charity. That, you know, if we want to help people to educate and empower them and all that good stuff, it's very well intentioned, but it doesn't go to that root cause. So this extremely simplistic statistic is suggesting that for every dollar that's going in aid to the global south, there's a very scant minimum, it's a much higher figure, but a very bare minimum of 5 coming back the other way to extremely wealthy countries. And that is through this, you know, few mechanisms like who sets trade rules. Remember in New Hampshire in 1944? They knew what they were doing, setting trade rules, how tax is paid or not paid and the rules that regulate that. And what we're looking at today is the imposition of debt on countries. So what that would look like, that 1 to 5, what it looks like in today's money would be 153 billion going in aid and a very bare minimum of 1,300 billion coming the other direction. I'm so bad at numbers that I need to make font sizes proportional to help me to understand to almost everything. So if we were longer together today and we were doing tax and trade, I had to get something that was about 5 slides long to fit the tax proportional font. It was just so literally off the charts. So we're looking at debt. So today, if we just sort of, you know, as of the world as we know it today, so-called developing countries are already paying massive amounts in debt repayments to extremely wealthy countries. And over the last 30 years, that's quite a tidy kind of cash transfer that this part of the world has enjoyed. But how it came about is what we're going to try to look at in like roughly 12 minutes. As I said, it was going to be brutal. So we could go back way further, obviously, right? But we're thinking about the period of decolonisation, of countries resisting and fighting and struggling for their independence. Quite a few countries would have looked for loans to try to redevelop because they've been asset stripped for generations and generations. So part of the story is about actually loans being put to good productive use. So Brazil would be an interesting example of that. But in many cases, it's a story of debt being foisted on countries as a weapon of control, as Thomas Sankara will explain if you have a chance to go back and look at that video. So we're going to focus a little bit on the 1970s. There was an oil crisis. So what currency is oil valued in, or sold in? Dollars, which is a whole story in itself, which is worth going into, but why? But so we had this oil crisis. So OPEC, this organisation of petroleum producing countries in it, they got together. They pushed the price of oil up, and this caused quite a crisis in the global markets, as you can imagine. I'm old enough to remember because I was 3 in 1973, and I think I do remember my parents queuing for oil, like around the country, around the corner in Bray, like this long queue of cars because the price was going up so fast. So if you're an oil-producing country, happy days, you're awash with petrodollars, and you put it in the bank, and do banks just leave it sitting there, like waiting for you to come back, just in case you want it again? So what do they do with money that
loan it out?
They reinvest, and it's obviously even that's a much more complex. They don't just wait for people to, you know, lodge before they invest. But yes, so the banks went on a massive spending spree. So the banks were awash with dollars and very keen to lend it out. So they went asking very few questions to the global south and were lending like there was no tomorrow, lending like there was no rule books either. They were very unethical about how they lent out. And interest rates at the time were extremely low, which is, again, a whole other story, but it meant that you could borrow at almost 0% and nobody's asking you any questions. Right? So this period, post-colonial period, this like massive trap basically is set. Because colonizers, we use this very neutral language, like they were granted their independence, these countries, or there was actually even an interesting one that was said just recently. How did you describe? There was a word, and again we tend to use these very neutral words about it just happened, decolonization just kind of happened, rather than was fought for, and colonizers fought back. Right, so they installed dictators all over the place and then funded them very nicely. So you could be the most obnoxious dictator in the world and you'd be rewarded for that at that time. So this massive rise in lending to the global south. So independence is starting to already look a bit loaded and weighed down with debt. Huge lending to dictators, no concerns for how those loans were used, or full knowledge that those loans were being used to oppress people. So they reckon that a quarter of the loans that were given out around that time was kind of so-called dictator debt, or in legal terms called odious debt. So the who's who of dictatorships actually has a spreadsheet that runs with it, that runs into the tens and even hundreds of billions. When Nelson Mandela was elected first black leader of an independent South Africa, one of the first things he got on his desk was a bill for $21 billion run up by the apartheid regime, because it is expensive to oppress people. There was also like lending for projects that were so like frivolous. I feel nearly bad even highlighting this one because it's every kind of wrong. Loans given to a dictatorship in the Philippines to just construct a nuclear power plant that was already a bit like dodgy spec. To be built at the foot of a volcano in an area that was prone to earthquakes. Had bad, dangerous lending, and that's bad enough, right? That's enough to get your blood pressure going. But how were interest rates while all this was happening? They were kind of pretty low. So countries were able, to an extent, to keep rolling it over with new loans if they needed to. Then, towards the end of the 70s, things started to get much stickier. Interest rates, price of oil went up again, so very high. And commodities that countries were selling on the global market in order to get hard currency to pay back their loans, that tanked. So your costs, if you're an oil importer, have just gone through the roof, and your income is going through the floor. And then the third element of this perfect storm is those like almost zero interest rates absolutely spiraled out of control. So this was the end for countries that were heavily indebted in the global south, which was most of them. Except China. China was very smart about paying back loans. China got out of debt as quick as it could.
There wasn't an orchestrated coup in China either.
Indeed, indeed, yes. So it was one bureaucrat in Washington said, with a little eye for drama, but actually probably not, it was like an atomic bomb being dropped on the financial system. Mexico was the first to threaten to default. Countries aren't supposed to default, countries aren't supposed to go bankrupt. They're supposed to always be able to kind of meet their debts, but the system kind of broke down under the weight of this much debt. So Mexico, then Brazil, and then the banking sector kind of stood back from its feeding trough for just long enough to realise that they had put themselves into existential threat. Because this wasn't just the danger of one or two banks going under, this was the entire global financial system on the brink of collapse. Does that sound familiar though? Yeah, there was a rehearsal. So we could look at who's responsible for this, because in terms of who picked up the tab, we kind of are familiar with who picks up the tab for these things. But where responsibility lies, it was not with citizens, people, and communities in the global south. These were things that were decisions that were made way over their heads and things that were out of their hands. So the IMF comes into this scenario and goes, "Oh my God, this is exactly why we exist. This is an emergency situation where you have people struggling to pay back loans and having to make desperate decisions about health, education and community supports in order to sort of pay back reckless commercial and government lending that wasn't even, according to their own rule books, ethical. Who do we bail out? So who do you think they bailed out? The citizens or the reckless lenders? You've seen this movie. So they did. They, not quite to the same extent that they did in our most recent crisis. They did like one or two little haircuts, but for the most part they bailed out the lenders, and they went away going, "Whew, that was close," and learned nothing. Or you could say they learned a lot. They learned, we get away with this. They learned there is no moral hazard. We are too big to fail. We will get away with this. So they did learn something actually. So the IMF, having bailed out the lenders, then turns around to the citizens, turns around to the people, the countries, and says, well, they're off your back now, you'll be glad to know. Now I'm your problem, the IMF, you owe me now. And I'm not a politician, I'm certainly not a humanitarian, so I'm not that concerned about whether you like me or don't like me, because I'm never going to face you at the polls or anything like that. I want to make adjustments to your economy so you can pay me back quicker. And I will. So they came up with a system called structural adjustment, which is as much fun as it sounds. They go in and they adjust your economy until it's extracting enough resources and wealth to pay them back. So the debt crisis of the Global South that was very familiar to people in the Global South, Thomas Sankara in that speech, we're definitely going to go back and look at it. He's talking about debt, its origins are colonial. And those who lent us the money had colonised us before, and now they're using this as a neo-colonial weapon, in which the colonisers transform themselves into technical assistants who come up with these policies. Like you say, they sound actually kind of benign. We should better call them technical assassins. So he calls this process that we just looked at the cleverly managed reconquest of Africa, of a whole region that had fought for its independence so courageously and then gets kind of ensnared again through the debt crisis.